Welcome to EDUC 6010, Theories of Learning and Instruction. As one of the most important of the foundational courses for pre-service teachers, EDUC 6010 will give you an opportunity to look at the various learning theories that are part and parcel of how we teach in today's classroom, at whatever level you might be teaching, either children, middle adults, or adults. In Learning Objective 1, we'll be looking at some of these specific theories and introducing the schools of educational psychology to you. So if you're ready to get started, Here are the three main topics that we'll be looking at in Learning Objective number 1. We will do an overview of the various learning theories, specifically of the three most important ones: behaviorism, cognitivism, and humanism. We will look at some of the characteristics of each of those three schools, and we will contemplate some of the specific characteristics that will help you distinguish classrooms of teachers that are using these three schools of educational psychology. Next, we will look at something that I call the pillars of education, so that we can place this course within the foundational courses of your pre-service program. And finally, we will give you a chance to listen to one of several video clips that will be identified for you during this course. This first one will be called How People Learn. As we get started on our overview, I want you to be sure that you have gone to the Blackboard site to Learning Objective number 1 and have copied or pasted or downloaded the textual material that we're going to be using throughout this PowerPoint presentation. In Learning Objective 1, you will see the specific overview right there for you. You can either copy and paste it into a Word document, or you can download it from the Blackboard site. Because on that overview, on that learning objective, are all of the terms and concepts and information that we're going to talk about during this session. So please take a look at it and pay particular attention to the first thing in that learning objective, which are the keywords, definitions, and concepts for discussion. These are the keywords that you need to look for when you're doing any of the reading, either online reading materials that I give you or the text material that are in the book. So we're going to begin with a learning theories overview. It's actually part of a website that's mentioned in, specifically cited in Learning Objective 1. You'll find it at academics.rmu.edu/tilde-tome, and I want you to be able to use that reference. Go to it now if you have a chance, and open up this primer exercise on learning theories as we begin to look at some of your beliefs about learning, looking at the major theorists and applications of behaviorism, cognitivism, and humanism. So you can stop this presentation at any time and then go ahead and restart it when you're ready with that web page in front of you. Okay, let's get started with actually a little exercise for you. If you have the Learning Objective 1 printed out, you should have a table there that looks something like this. And we're going to go through this table together because, as you will see, this becomes a foundation for where you are in the course at the very beginning. I want you to go through each of these 8 items and put a check next to the agree or disagree in terms of these 8 statements. I want you to pick one of them. I mean, pick agree or disagree. Do not leave any of the 8 blank. So let's go through them fairly quickly. Do you believe that learners need grades, gold stars, and other incentives as a motivation to learn and accomplish what goes on in the classroom? If you agree with that statement, check the first box. If you disagree, obviously check the second. Okay, the next statement. Learners can be trusted to find their own goals and should have some options or choices in what they learn at school. Be very specific on this now. agree or disagree. Don't waffle. Don't say in some particular cases or maybe with certain students. I want you to be kind of black and white on this table here. Okay, item number 3, teachers need to determine what students are thinking about while solving problems. So if you're a teacher that says, I want to see your work, then you would agree with that question. If you're a teacher that says, I want to see the answer, and it's either right or wrong, then perhaps you would disagree with that. Item number 4, students should be graded according to a uniform standards. In other words, everybody is graded the same. Okay? If you agree with that, check that box. If you agree or you have the idea that I can change my standards based on perhaps the IQ of the student or whether a student tries harder in class than other students, then perhaps you would disagree with that statement. Item number 5, students should set their own standards and evaluate their own works. Agree or disagree? Number 6, curriculum should be organized along subject matter lines that are carefully sequenced. Agree or disagree? Number 7, the teacher should help students monitor and control their own learning behavior. That's a good statement for you to think about for a second before you check agree or disagree. And then finally, the student experience should help students develop positive relationships with their peers. So again, I want you to take a look at those 8 statements, and I want you to check each of the boxes, and then we'll talk about them. So again, you can stop the presentation at this time until you have all 8 of those checked, and then start again. Okay, let's see how you did. If you selected statements 1, 4, and 6, you should be able to see a common pattern among those 3 characteristics or those 3 statements. In each of these cases, 1, 4, and 6 are most strongly supported by behavioral teachers, by those teachers that believe it takes some extrinsic motivation. It takes a stimulus, a response, and perhaps a reinforcement for students to actually learn. So if you picked 1, 4, and 6, you might have picked some of the others as we went through here, but if you picked 1, 4, and 6 specifically, then put down a little note to yourself that you are exhibiting behavioristic tendencies. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing great with that. It's just I want you to know how you learn, how you teach, so that as we go through this entire course, we can talk about the other ways in which you can address learning styles in your own classroom. So again, 1, 4, and 6 is behaviorists. Okay, statements 3 and 7 now. If you believe that you want to know what students are thinking about while they're solving problems, and you want to help them learn how to control their own behavior, then you are most likely a cognitivist. A cognitivist believes in certain things like ages and stages. They believe in building block approach to learning. These are the items that are most characteristic of the cognitive teacher. And again, what we'll find out later on in the course, and maybe a little later on in this session, is that the majority of us probably fall into this school of educational psychology as a cognitivist teacher. Okay, the third school of educational psychology that we'll be discussing during this course lends itself to statements 2, 5, and 8. And those are the humanistic tendencies, the humanistic characteristics of educational psychology, where the focus is more on the learner. You can see that in those 3 statements. Learners can be trusted to find their own goals. They should set their own standards. And positive relationships are the key. So those are the 3 characteristics, again, of the humanistic psychologist and the humanistic teacher. Now again, as we get going on this, I want you to identify which of those three schools you are. As a matter of fact, the assessment at the end of this particular learning objective, this first learning objective, is for you to actually write a journal article for me. It's just I call it a journal, but it's a 1 to 3 page paper on the topic of your personal psychology of learning. And I want you to tell me which of the three you predominantly take after, okay? And we'll talk more about assessment a little bit later. For now, we're going to continue on and look a little bit now at some of the other learning theories in general. One of the assignments for today was to specifically read the 3 introductory chapters. It didn't matter whether you're using the Driscoll book, the Gredler book, or the Slavin book. Their introductions to learning theories, the role of theory in learning and instruction, and educational psychology as a foundation for teaching will give you a theoretical overview of learning theories. Specifically, what I wanted you to cover was to look at, get your own definition of learning. Now here's a teaching learning model by one of my favorite instructors when I was going through my program, a gentleman by the name of Myron Dembo. Haven't seen him in many, many years, but his model that you see here talks about the 9 elements that define learning. And you can take a look at this particular model and compare it to the reading that I'm asking you to do in those chapters. He defined learning as a persistent change in human behavior, okay? Or a change brought about from our experiences and interactions either with one another or with the environment. And so I want you to compare and contrast these definitions that you've read in the 3 textbooks with our buddy Myron Dembo. Look at things like results. You're going to be looking at, changes in performance. What are the results of learning? Is it something that you can see, or is it something that is a little less obvious? What are the means of learning, the processes by which you can change an individual? Okay, and finally, what triggers these processes? What triggers them? What makes them happen? What are the different inputs? You'll find that that is very, very different among the 3 schools of educational thought. For example, as you start to read a little from the Driscoll book, he talks about the process for building his theory, about making assumptions about the nature of knowledge, the use of questions and observations and explanations, generating hypotheses. Okay? He talks about comparing results and revising your theory of learning. Let me ask you this question as we get started here. What is your own theory of learning? How do you learn? Okay, think about that and add that to your journal paper that you're going to send me. How do you learn yourself? And does it seem to be consistent with the schools of educational psychology? If you're reading the Gredler book, you'll find out that she talks a little bit about why we're studying learning and why is it important. It's important for the individual, the importance for society, the importance for us as teachers. Okay? She talks a little bit about assumptions and key terms and what she calls testable propositions as a way of developing a criteria for learning theory. Okay? And then she talks a little bit about how learning is a tool as a guide for planning instruction, for evaluating, diagnosing, and creating research. Okay? So each of these theorists have a particular point of view. And finally, if you are taking or using the Slavin book, when he talks about educational psychology, he talks about teaching as decision making, and most importantly about learning as adaptation. So what you're going to find is all three of these authors are very much cognitivists. Okay, so keep that in mind as you're going through the books, because each of them are going to be somewhat similar in their definition of learning and learning theories. That's pretty much why I let you take any of the three books for this course. But what was nice about them is all three of them basically talk about the same theorists, the same critical advocates. For example, in behaviorism, all three of them will give you something about Ivan Pavlov and V.F. Skinner. They will all give you information about Jean Piaget and Jerome Bruner as the key cognitivist theorists. And they will all give you information about Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers as the key advocates of humanism. So as you go through your reading, keep this model in mind. Start taking notes under each of these areas. But the key is going to be, for this course, is going to be the block number 4. We're going to be talking about principles of learning. Now, one of the most important things I think that we can talk about here under Learning Objective 1 as we get started in this course is this concept that I can't take all the credit for it, but I kind of created the term called pillars of education. I wanted you to see where educational psychology falls in this preparation program of becoming a teacher. Again, whether you're going to become a K-12 teacher or a higher ed teacher or a corporate trainer, these 5 pillars are critical to an understanding of how you're going to use teaching as a tool for society. And here's the questions. You know, the philosophy of education, the psychology, the sociology, history, and leadership. And in the handout, in the Blackboard, Learning Objective 1, I talk about the key questions that each of these areas answers. For example, the philosophy question answers the question, what are we teaching? And you see here on this slide, there's 3 basic what questions that we're answering. Over the course of American education, that's what I'm talking about here, American education, we've had 3 major philosophies of education. The first is essentialism. Okay, essentialism. In other words, education as it first started was designed to teach the 3 R's, the traditional approach to education, the basics of education. And so if you're in a school or a school district or a university that is teaching the critical skills as their target, then I think you could easily say that you're in a essentialistic environment. Their philosophy of education is essentialistic. The second area, or the second philosophy of what do we teach, is progressivism. And I think you see that a lot in the United States as well, that what we ought to be teaching in our schools is what is most relevant to our lives. And there's some pros and cons with each of these, and as you start to go through the reading, I want you to think about those. And the final philosophy of education is called perennialism. It's based on a support of a universal education. What are things that are key to all teaching and all education? Perennialists would believe in a curriculum that should be taught the same across the country. in every state, in each school district, in every school. So keep that in mind as you're looking at this. And you will take a course, you should have a course, you do here at Robert Morris, a course in the philosophy of education, which talks about these three approaches and a few others in much more detail. As you might expect, the psychology of education is certainly the most important to us in this particular course. The psychology of education addresses the question, how do we teach? And again, we're going to be exploring the three major schools of educational psychology. We'll begin our learning objectives in this course with a look at behaviorism, and specifically Pavlov and Skinner, the classical and operant conditioning of the behaviors, in which stimulus, response, and reinforcement are the keys to learning. All behavior is learned. We're going to talk about positive and negative reinforcement, and we're going to talk about the importance of organizing your lesson in a particular sequence. These are all characteristics that come out of the school of behavioristic education. Again, how do we teach? We teach by stimulus and response. We teach by considering the impact of the learner, or the impact of the environment on the learning. Okay? So much more to be said about that, but these are your key words for behaviorism. Cognitivism might be the most interesting of the three schools. Behaviorism started in the 1940s and 1950s. As we'll see later on, cognitivism developed in the 60s and the 70s. Cognitivism looks at education and learning much differently. For the behaviorist, prior knowledge is not important. They do not consider prior knowledge at all in terms of the stimulus, response, and reinforcement. To the cognitivist, prior knowledge is all important. How information was obtained in the past and what we have to build on is the key to cognitive psychology. How we process information, how we structure it, how we build on it. They have terms such as scaffolding, where we take a basic piece of information and we add to it. Think about the difference in the way we learn mathematics. The behaviorist would say 2 times 2 is 4. We pat you on the back, we give you a candy bar, you learn that 2 plus 2 is 4. But they have a hard time explaining how we take that information and build into algebra, for example. The cognitivist says, we've got the answer. We're building on that prior knowledge, and we're building the approach of mathematics for things like long division. To learn long division, it can't be a stimulus, response, and reinforcement. It has to be an application of addition, subtraction, and multiplication. So they would argue with the behaviorists that information is processed and structured. They also argue that cognitive development is based on what they call ages and stages. Okay? There are certain things that you cannot learn when you're 2 years old. Okay? And so what you'll find from our theorist Jean Piaget is that he has 4 stages of cognitive development, and we'll talk about those. And they're very much age-based. Okay? The cognitivist likes the concepts of assimilation and accommodation. Okay? Taking new information and being able to link it to something in the past, okay, which is assimilation, or taking new information that has nothing in our background and learning how to take something that we do know how to do and accommodate it. We'll talk more about those later. Building blocks, schemata, again, very important concepts to the cognitive psychologist. And finally, our third psychology of education is the humanists. Again, we talked about this a little bit when we looked at the table, but the humanist is all about self-actualization, self-learning. I don't know if you've ever heard the concept of the teacher doesn't teach, the learner has to learn. And that's very much a humanistic concept from a gentleman named Carl Rogers. Okay, I've heard this argument even at the university level. I don't teach, you learn. And I am not a successful instructor unless you have learned something. Those concepts all stem from the humanistic school of educational psychology. We'll talk about people's feelings and how they feel about what they feel about learning. We'll talk about positive communications, cooperative learning, and most importantly, the personalization of information. So those are all concepts that are all part of the psychology of education. Okay, let's not forget where we are. We're looking at these 5 pillars. We've talked about the philosophy of education, the what, and we've talked about the psychology of education, the how. One of the courses that you're going to take in your pre-service program is the sociology of education. I call this the who part. Who are we teaching? And my goodness, I can't imagine that anybody would disagree with the fact that over the years, American schools have had to address the who part of teaching perhaps more than any of the other pillars. So many things have changed. In the sociology courses, you're going to look at American schools as agents of society. We used to teach students much different kinds of students in the past that we have in the current. I mean, just think of the X generation. Think of the baby boomers. Think of the students that are coming to your class now with a set of skills and competencies that were foreign to us as little as 5 years ago. And so a lot of books are being written now about the sociology of education. So when it comes time to take that course, these are some of the concepts and things that you're going to be looking at. Equality, organization, effects, socialization issues, what's going on in the classroom management issues. I think you'll find that to be a fascinating course that will be very important to your preparation as a teacher. One of my favorite courses when I was going through my doctorate program was a history of education. I mean, I'm like everybody else. I don't particularly enjoy learning dates and names, but it's important for you to place today's educational environments in terms of the when we are teaching. So this is the question now: when in the history of education are we teaching? And so to do that correctly, you have to get a background in the legislative history of American education. I'll show you some of those key pieces of legislation in a minute. But these are the 6 commonly accepted periods of education. Okay? The early European influences, the colonial period, and so on, until we get to the modern period of American education. Let me ask you a question for you to think about. Why were American schools originally established? What was the first piece of American legislation dealing with education? Let you think about that for a second. When you think you have it, go on to the next slide. If you've had an educational history class, you probably knew the answer to this. But if you didn't, you might be surprised to know that one of the first pieces of American legislation, or legislation in the Americas, if you will, was in 1647. And it was commonly known as the Old Deluder-Sainton Act. And it was passed to establish schools in towns of at least 100 families for the express purpose of teaching what you needed to teach so as to delude Satan. So they were religious in nature, yes, but they also began to establish the basic grammar school system that we've had in the United States. Teach the student enough information to help them become a viable citizen of the new country. Now, I'm not going to go through these other pieces of legislation here. They're in your handouts. They're on this slide. These are actually links that if you want to go and learn a little bit more about them. But just look at the 4 or 5 that are the most important historical items as our pillars of education. The Land Grant Act of 1862, which basically gave government land to each of the states to establish higher education. Anytime you hear of a state college, okay, Pennsylvania State University, Ohio State University, those were all universities that came into existence as a direct result of the endowment of this Land Grant Act. Okay, 1954, Brown versus Kansas Board of Education, Topeka Board of Education, which basically eliminated the separate but equal ruling of Plessy and Ferguson back in 1896. Basically started the integration of our schools. Probably very few of you are as old as I am, but I was born in 1950, and although I don't remember this act in 1954, I was certainly affected by it when I got into elementary school. Okay, 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which basically created Title I, Head Start. It's been amended many times throughout the century, last century, to the point where we had in 1990 PL 101-476, which was the Disability Education Act. Major changes, and probably the most important contemporary act was in 2001 with No Child Left Behind. We don't have time in this course to go through the historical implications, but history of education is one of your 5 pillars. Okay, this last pillar of education, leadership. Philosophy was the what, psychology was the how, sociology was the who, history was the when, and leadership I'm calling the whom. You know, whom are the key advocates of education. And I understand that that is not grammatically correct, but it's still a good way for you to remember the key elements of this particular pillar of education. And I hope you get a course just on the leaders of American education. We'll certainly talk about many of them in this course. We will talk about Skinner and even Pavlov under the guise of behavioralism. We will talk about Bloom. We will talk about Dewey. We will talk about Erickson. We will talk about Gardner, and we will talk about Piaget as the main advocates of cognitive psychology. And as I mentioned already, we will talk about Maslow and Rogers when we talk about the humanistic part of education. But there are many other names that are not on this list. Madeline Hunter, okay, Leon Vygotsky. We will talk about as many of these leaders in education as we can as we go through this program. But those are your 5 key pillars of education. I wanted you again to see where psychology falls. I think if you're going to talk about these 5 pillars, I would argue that psychology of education, the how do we teach, is going to be the most important elements, the most important of those 5 pillars. So I want to encourage you to make the most out of EDUC 6010 as we get started on these specific objectives. Get the most out of the psychology course. We call this course Theories of Learning and Instruction, but it's basically EdPsych 101. And do as much reading as you can, as much as time allows, and look at as many different ways of thinking about learning theories as possible. And to do that, I'm going to give you access to what I think is probably the most exciting media library that you'll ever run across. Meet me on the next slide. In your Learning Objective 1 on the web, you will see an element on there called Introduction to Learning Theory. And it's tagged as a VOD, a video on demand. I want you to explore some of the learning theories that have been created by the Annenberg Media Library. And it's at this web address that you see here, www.learner.org. I'm going to give you specific sessions in a course called The Learning Classroom, Theory into Practice. They actually have, I think, if I remember right, 30-some lessons, 30-some sessions. I'm not going to have you look at them all, but there's a handful of them that I think are just so well done that I want you to go out and visit them. The link is right there in Blackboard. How you find the session is explained to you. It's session number 1 in this case, how people learn an introduction to learning theory. The program introduces basically the main themes of this entire course that we will see excerpts from. This first particular session has some teacher interviews and classroom footage that illustrates how important learning theory is to our development as teachers. And so I want you to go out there and take a look at these. None of these sessions are more than 28 minutes long, so you can view this session at any time. I think this particular one is, well, it's 28 minutes and 28 seconds to be precise, but none of them are more than a half hour long that I recall. So again, as part of this learning objective number 1, go out to Annenberg Media site and take a look at this first session in the course called The Learning Classroom, Theory into Practice. Okay, we finished pretty much our first learning objective together. I will be using these narrated PowerPoint presentations throughout the course. You can view the ones that are called online sessions at any time. As we get together in some of the synchronous sessions, beginning with learning objective number 3, I'm going to be going back to these discussions. So I want you to make sure you have grasped these keywords, definitions, and concepts. I want you to be sure that if I ask you what connectionism is, if I ask you what behaviorism is, if I ask you what the teaching learning model is, you can have a graduate level discussion with me, okay, and with one another. As part of assessment number 1, I'm asking you again to prepare a 1 to 3 page journal paper on the topic called My Personal Psychology of Learning, in which you pick one of the 3 schools of educational psychology that we have introduced here and that we have tied to that 8-statement table at the beginning of our time together. You are going to be predominantly a a behaviorist, a cognitivist, or a humanist. You will have agreed with some of the other statements, but you'll be predominantly one of those three. Figure out which one it is. Write me a short paper that talks to me about your personal beliefs of teaching and learning at this very early juncture in the course. I know we haven't gone through any of these schools in any kind of significant detail. So I'm going to, if you looked ahead in the syllabus, I'm going to ask you to do the same thing at the end of the course and see whether your school has changed. It probably won't, but what this course is going to do is make you realize which one you are and make you realize that you might be in a classroom in which students have a different approach to learning than you do. And we'll be talking a lot during this course about the different applications of these three schools and how you can help all of your students learn. So that's basically Learning Objective 1. It gets us started. It gives you a chance to get into the Blackboard system and get yourself going. Of course, you can go back and review this material as often as you like. And I'm going to close now, and certainly look forward to our next online session, in which we talk specifically about the first school of educational psychology, the one that began first, not in education, but more in business, more in manufacturing, and that's the School of Behaviorism. So take a look at Learning Objective 1, start working on your journal paper, and make sure that you get it to me by the established due date. That's it for now.